December 11th, 2003, Mansfield, Texas, a suburban community where crime seemed almost foreign. Christmas lights twinkled on rooftops. Families tucked in for the night. Everything about that evening felt calm, until a call came through to 911. It was from the home of Rick and Susanna Wamsley, but there was no voice, no whisper, only silence. The dispatcher stayed on the line, hoping for a word, a sign of distress, anything. Nothing came. Moments later, the call abruptly ended. Police officers were immediately sent to the Wamsley residence. As they approached, they noticed something unusual. The garage door was ajar. Inside, the home was eerily still. No signs of a struggle at first glance. No shattered glass. No broken locks. But then they saw her. Susanna Wamsley, just 45 years old, lay motionless on the living room couch. Blood pooled beneath her. Steps away near the front entryway was Rick Wamsley, 46. He too was gone, his body surrounded by a devastating scene of violence. Both had been shot multiple times. Both had been stabbed. Whoever had done this hadn't come for valuables. Expensive jewelry, electronics, even $15,000 in cash upstairs, untouched. To neighbors and friends, Rick and Susanna seemed to live the ideal American life. Successful careers, a beautiful home, a son and daughter on the brink of adulthood. They were the kind of family others aspired to become. But appearances can deceive. As investigators searched for a motive, they would uncover something chilling. This wasn't a random act. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was calculated, cold, planned from within, a family shattered from the inside out. Tonight we uncover how love, loyalty, and blood ties were severed by greed. This is the story of the Wamsley family murders. To the outside world, Rick and Susanna Wamsley were the epitome of success. A happy, affluent couple living in Mansfield, Texas, a quiet suburban town just outside of Dallas. Their life appeared perfect, a model for others to follow. Rick, an executive in a successful corporate job, was known for his charm and professionalism. Susanna, a warm and dedicated mother, was the glue that held the family together. Always focused on their two children, Andrew and Sarah, the Wamsleys had what many dreamed of: a beautiful home, a thriving family, and financial stability. Their home, nestled in a picturesque neighborhood, was filled with laughter and love. But like many families, there were cracks hidden beneath the surface. Those who knew Rick and Susanna well would attest to a certain tension that seemed to linger in the air. Their son Andrew had always been a bit different. He was smart, charismatic, but something about him seemed off. A restless spirit, his desire to be more, to live a life that was less ordinary, became a point of friction with his parents. While Rick and Susanna hoped for Andrew to follow a traditional path of education, work, and responsibility, Andrew was drawn to a different lifestyle, a life of excess, easy money, and rebellion. The more he veered from his parents' expectations, the more strained their relationship became. Andrew's life would take a turn when he met Chelsea Richardson. Chelsea, a woman who would soon play a devastating role in the Wamsley family tragedy, was strikingly different from Andrew's parents. She was a free spirit, unafraid of breaking rules, living on the edge. Chelsea's arrival in Andrew's life marked the beginning of a dangerous alliance. She quickly realized that Andrew's family had something she wanted: the Wamsleys' wealth. While Andrew was still living under his parents' roof, he found himself drawn deeper into Chelsea's web. She was ambitious, manipulative, and used Andrew's frustrations to her advantage. Together, they dreamed of a life free from the constraints of responsibility and hard work, a life they could build by any means necessary. But this wasn't simply about Andrew's discontent. It was about something much darker, something that would eventually lead to a conspiracy within their own home, a plan to end the Wamsleys' lives and take everything they had worked for. Behind the well-maintained walls of the Wamsley home, things were unraveling. Andrew had made it clear to Chelsea that he was dissatisfied with the life his parents had given him. He wanted more. And Chelsea, eager for her own fortune, saw an opportunity. She wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of what she felt she deserved. It was during this time that Chelsea introduced Andrew to her friend, Susanna Toledano. Susanna, another young woman struggling with her own demons, was quickly pulled into the plan. What started as a conversation over dinner soon became a detailed scheme, a plot that would end with Rick and Susanna's deaths. As the Wamsleys' family picture perfect on the outside, Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna began making their darkest plans behind closed doors. What the world couldn't see was a growing sense of entitlement, a desperate desire for wealth, and a willingness to do whatever it took to get it. The very people who should have been trusted, their son and his girlfriend, were ready to tear the family apart for a fortune. They believed they could get away with it. They believed they were smarter than anyone else. But no plan is foolproof, and as the Wamsleys' lives were about to be torn apart, the signs were there, waiting to be uncovered. Andrew Wamsley seemed like any other young man in his 20s. Born into a family with wealth and opportunity, he had the world at his fingertips. His parents, Rick and Susanna, were known for their strong work ethic and success, having built a comfortable life. But beneath the surface, Andrew harbored resentment. Though he came from privilege, Andrew's relationship with his parents was strained. He never quite fit the mold they had imagined for him. Rick, an accomplished professional, expected his son to follow a path toward business success, perhaps even join the family's wealth-building ventures. Susanna, a loving mother, was no different. She had dreams for Andrew to settle down, start a family, and embrace the future they had worked so hard to provide. But Andrew resisted. He wasn't interested in a conventional career. He didn't want the family's expectations pressing down on him. What started as minor tension over lifestyle choices soon turned into a deeper resentment. Andrew wanted freedom. He wanted control of his own life, and he wanted money, a lot of it. By the time he was in his 20s, Andrew had dropped out of college. He had dreams of making a fortune, not through hard work and traditional means, but through shortcuts. And he believed that the quickest way to financial freedom was through the wealth his parents had accumulated. But the Wamsleys had always been tight with their money. Rick and Susanna didn't lavish their children with every desire, pushing them instead to work for what they wanted. Andrew wasn't content with that. He wanted more, and he wanted it now. In 2002, Andrew moved in with his girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, someone who would have a profound influence on the decisions he would make in the months to come. Chelsea was not from the same affluent background. She had a troubled past and had experienced hardship, which made her desperate for a life of luxury. But Chelsea wasn't just interested in the riches Andrew's family had to offer. She was also a source of encouragement, pushing Andrew to take matters into his own hands. She shared his discontent with the life his parents had imposed on him, feeding into his growing frustration. Andrew had always been rebellious, but with Chelsea's influence, he began to see the possibility of an escape. The solution seemed simple: money, not earned through hard work, but stolen. He would not inherit his parents' wealth through a long life of labor or waiting. He would take it by force. It wasn't long before Chelsea and Andrew began plotting a way to seize control of Rick and Susanna's estate, which was estimated to be worth over $1.65 million. The family's life insurance policy, worth an additional $1 million, was also a tempting lure for both of them. The Wamsleys trusted their son, but Andrew was already planning his betrayal. Little did his parents know, the very person they loved and trusted most was now their most dangerous enemy. Chelsea Richardson was not just Andrew Wamsley's girlfriend. She was the person who fueled the fire of his darkest desires. At just 19 years old, Chelsea seemed to embody everything Andrew wanted in a partner: bold, ambitious, and eager to escape the constraints of a life she found suffocating. She came from a troubled background, having grown up in a broken home, but her relationship with Andrew would take her down a much darker path than either of them could have imagined. To Andrew, Chelsea was more than just a romantic partner. She was a confidant, someone who shared his frustrations, his dreams, and ultimately his greed. Their relationship grew intense quickly, but it wasn't just love that brought them closer. Chelsea was determined, manipulative even, and she quickly began to see the Wamsleys' comfortable life as a golden opportunity. At first, Chelsea appeared to be the perfect match for Andrew in the eyes of his family. She was charming, polite, and seemingly eager to fit into their social circles. But as their relationship progressed, cracks began to show. Andrew's relationship with his parents, particularly his father Rick, had always been strained. Rick had high expectations for Andrew, pushing him to do better academically and in life. To Andrew, it felt like a constant reminder of his inadequacy. Chelsea, ever the opportunist, fueled his resentment and gave him the validation he craved. As the relationship deepened, Andrew confided in Chelsea about his frustrations with his parents, especially with Rick, whom he felt was controlling. Andrew, in turn, began to feed Chelsea's desires for a life of wealth and freedom, free from the struggles of their current financial instability. Soon, the discussions turned from frustrations to fantasies. They began talking about what it would take to live the life they dreamed of. The Wamsleys' home, their wealth, and the life insurance policy Andrew would inherit if his parents died. All of it became part of their private conversations. Chelsea's role in these discussions was undeniable. It wasn't long before she became the driving force behind turning these thoughts into action. In Chelsea, Andrew found someone who not only encouraged his darker thoughts but also helped them come to life. She made him feel justified in his resentment toward his parents, and together, they started plotting. It wasn't just a fleeting thought, it became a plan that would involve more than just Andrew and Chelsea. Chelsea knew how to manipulate those around her, and soon, she pulled in her roommate, Susanna Toledano, to join their scheme. But while Chelsea was an active participant, it was her influence over Andrew that made everything fall into place. Chelsea convinced him that they could finally escape their troubles, but only if they removed the obstacles standing in their way. The idea of murder seemed to be the only way out. The Wamsleys were the key to their new life, and Chelsea was determined to make that happen. Her persistence, coupled with Andrew's fragile state of mind, pushed him further down a path of no return. And so, it was Chelsea Richardson who played the pivotal role in making Andrew's darkest impulses a reality that would shatter the Wamsley family and forever alter the course of their lives. Behind the closed doors of the Wamsley home, a dark truth was about to unfold. While their neighbors saw the Wamsleys as the epitome of suburban bliss, a successful couple, raising 2 kids in a pristine home, within that house, things were falling apart. Rick and Susanna's son Andrew had always felt like the black sheep of the family. At 23, he had the world at his feet, or so it seemed. He was enrolled in college, but rarely showed up. His grades were slipping, his future uncertain. His father Rick had grown increasingly frustrated with Andrew's lack of direction, constantly pressuring him to get his life together. But Andrew had no interest in conforming to his parents' expectations. Andrew wanted more. And that desire wasn't just about success or career, it was about money. His lifestyle, his wants and his needs were constantly at odds with the life his parents envisioned for him. Living off their wealth wasn't enough for him anymore. He wanted total control, and for that he believed he needed his parents' estate. Andrew met Chelsea at a low point in his life. She had her own baggage, a troubled childhood, and a past full of mistakes, but together they were a perfect match, both seeking a way to escape their circumstances, both looking for a path to financial freedom. It wasn't long before they became inseparable, but it wasn't just love that kept them together. Chelsea had a unique understanding of Andrew's frustrations. She was the first person to truly listen to him, to understand the depth of his dissatisfaction. And when Andrew began to open up about his strained relationship with his parents, Chelsea saw an opportunity. Chelsea had been living with Andrew in the family home, but her involvement in the Wamsley family dynamic was starting to take a more insidious turn. It was no longer about the relationship. It was about money. And more importantly, it was about Andrew's inheritance. She saw the potential for a life of luxury, a life free from their financial worries. But Chelsea knew that for Andrew to inherit, something had to change. His parents needed to be gone. Chelsea's idea was simple. Andrew could kill his parents, inherit the family wealth, and the two of them could start fresh. But she wasn't the only one who saw the financial windfall. Chelsea reached out to her roommate, Susanna Toledano, to help with the plot. Susanna, a quiet woman, wasn't fully committed at first. She was hesitant to involve herself in such a crime, but Chelsea's persuasion proved irresistible. She played on Susanna's own vulnerabilities and personal struggles, convincing her that this was the only way forward. The promise of money and a fresh start was too tempting. Together, the three of them began to plan the perfect crime. They knew the Wamsleys' financial situation, Rick and Susanna's estate, the life insurance policy, and their sizable bank accounts. Andrew's share of the inheritance alone would set him up for life. But it wasn't just about the money for Andrew, it was about proving something to himself, proving that he could take control, that he could break free from his parents' authority. They began to carefully map out every detail. They discussed when the crime would happen. It had to be when the parents were home, but also when no one would suspect them. Andrew's parents trusted him. They saw him as their son, someone who would eventually take over the family business. They wouldn't suspect that he was planning to murder them. The weapon was another problem to solve. Chelsea, ever the practical one, suggested they buy a gun, but Andrew wasn't sure he was ready to kill with a firearm. Instead, they decided on something more personal, something that would make their intentions clear. They would stab their victims. It would be brutal and intimate, a final statement of control. But as the days passed, cracks began to appear in the plan. They realized that simply murdering Rick and Susanna wouldn't be enough. They needed to make sure they left no evidence behind. The house needed to look like a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence. They needed a motive that would disguise their true intentions. So, they decided to stage the crime. They would make it appear as if the Wamsleys had been victims of an intruder, someone who had targeted them for their wealth. The police would be led to believe it was a simple home invasion gone wrong. Andrew felt increasingly confident. He and Chelsea spent hours discussing the final details, the time the crime would take place, the escape routes, the aftermath. Susanna, meanwhile, grew more anxious. Her role was clear, but her nerves began to show. She had never been involved in anything like this before, but Chelsea reassured her. It was too late to back out now. They were in this together, and they had to finish what they started. And as the day of the murder drew closer, each of them became more and more convinced that they could pull it off. They were blinded by their greed, by the promise of a future free from the constraints of their current lives. They believed the Wamsleys were just obstacles standing between them and the life they deserved. But no matter how perfect the plan seemed, none of them could foresee the fatal mistakes that would unravel everything. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. The conspiracy had taken root. And when the night arrived, everything would change. The Wamsley family's seemingly perfect life was anything but. Behind closed doors, a twisted plot had begun to take shape. A plan driven by greed, envy, and a cold desire for money. It all started with Andrew Wamsley, the Wamsleys' only son. In his late 20s, Andrew had always struggled to meet his parents' expectations. His relationship with them had been strained for years, and he often clashed with their conservative views. But what seemed like typical rebelliousness was about to escalate into something far darker. Andrew had always dreamed of financial freedom. He wanted more than just his parents' approval. He wanted their wealth. Susanna and Rick were not only well off, they were careful with their money. In their will, they had promised to leave everything to Andrew and his sister Sarah. But Andrew wanted it now, all of it. And so began his deadly ambition. It wasn't long before Andrew met Chelsea Richardson. Chelsea was a troubled young woman, drawn to Andrew's charm and aspirations. She was fiercely loyal to him, but her loyalty was also tied to something darker. Chelsea shared Andrew's desire for the Wamsleys' fortune, and together, they began to devise a plan. But Andrew didn't act alone. He had help from Chelsea's roommate, Susanna Toledano. Susanna was drawn into their conspiracy, not out of her own greed, but out of a twisted sense of loyalty to Chelsea. The three of them formed a dangerous alliance, one that would soon lead to betrayal and murder. Their plan at first wasn't as sophisticated as they hoped. They tried twice before the night of the murders to carry out their deadly scheme. Both attempts failed miserably, but not without consequence. The first attempt was reckless. Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna decided to take a more direct approach. They planned to ambush Rick and Susanna as they returned home from a night out. They had hoped to catch them off guard, but things quickly went wrong. As Rick and Susanna drove into their garage, Andrew was supposed to fire a gun from a hidden position, but the weapon jammed. Panic set in. They fled the scene, not just with their lives, but with a sense of failure. The second attempt was even more disastrous. This time they decided to tamper with the car. They would sabotage Rick's vehicle, causing an accident that would kill him and his wife. They hoped to stage it as a tragic accident. They worked in the dead of night, using the tools they had borrowed from a friend. But as the hours passed, nothing seemed to go according to plan. They damaged the car, but not enough to cause an immediate fatal crash. Desperate to make it work, they hid in the shadows, waiting for the couple to drive off. But again, nothing happened. Rick and Susanna had stayed home that night, unaware of the danger lurking just outside. Both attempts had failed. But Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna didn't stop. Their desperation grew. With each failed plot, their resolve hardened. They knew the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about seeing their plan through. Failure wasn't an option, but what was missing from these failed attempts wasn't just planning. It was the resolve to cross the final line. That final line would be crossed in the most brutal way. In a moment where the act was no longer a distant fantasy, but a cold, ruthless reality. The night of the murders was drawing near, and as the days passed, the trio perfected their plans. They learned from their previous mistakes and grew more confident that they could carry out the ultimate betrayal. No longer would there be an attempt at a quick, clean plan. They would finish what they started, no matter the cost. It wasn't a question of if they would kill Rick and Susanna. It was a question of when, and that question would soon be answered. It was a cold Thursday evening in Mansfield, Texas. Rick and Susanna Wamsley were at home, winding down from their day, unaware that the quiet of their suburban neighborhood would soon be shattered. Their two children, Andrew and Sarah, had already retreated to their rooms, but for Andrew, the night was just beginning. Andrew Wamsley had been planning this moment for months. The once loving son had already made up his mind. He would kill his parents. His motivations were clear: greed, and the promise of a lucrative inheritance. The Wamsleys' wealth, a $1.65 million estate, and life insurance policies, had caught Andrew's eye. The plan had grown darker as he involved his girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, and her roommate, Susanna Toledano. Around 9:30 p.m., Andrew returned home. He pretended nothing was out of the ordinary, acting like any other night. But inside he was bracing for what he was about to do. He had unlocked the garage door earlier, leaving the house vulnerable. His parents, unwittingly, had no idea that their son was about to betray them in the most horrific way. By 11 p.m., the house was quiet. Rick and Susanna had finished their evening routine. Susanna sat in the living room, while Rick made his way upstairs to retire for the night. Andrew knew the time had come. Andrew opened the garage door, stepping cautiously into the hallway. Chelsea, waiting in the car outside, was ready to provide the distraction. Susanna, stationed just inside the house, had her instructions to kill. As Rick and Susanna settled into their home, their peaceful evening took a sudden, terrifying turn. Susanna barely had time to react when a gunshot echoed through the house. She was shot at point-blank range. Rick, hearing the shot, rushed toward the source of the sound, but it was too late. As he entered the room, Andrew was already in position, and before he could act, he was gunned down as well. The violence was quick, but it was far from over. In the dim light, Susanna, the final conspirator, emerged from her hiding spot. She was armed. With chilling precision, she stabbed both Rick and Susanna multiple times. There was no struggle, no resistance. The murderers had planned this moment carefully, and now they believed they had succeeded. By 11:30 p.m., the home had fallen eerily silent. The perpetrators had fled. The Wamsleys, once alive and well, were now lying in pools of their own blood. The scene was chillingly clean, almost methodical. There was no sign of a break-in. Their valuables, including $15,000 in cash, were left untouched. It seemed as though nothing had been stolen, and nothing was out of place, except for the horrific scene in the living room. Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna believed they had gotten away with the perfect crime, but what they didn't know was that their actions were far from flawless. there were details, little things they hadn't accounted for, that would soon unravel the carefully laid plan. The Wamsley family's tragic night had come to an end, but the investigation was just beginning. What seemed like an ideal crime was in fact a series of mistakes that would soon be exposed. The investigation into the Wamsley murders began with more questions than answers. On the surface, the crime didn't make sense. No forced entry, no sign of a robbery. The house was immaculate, untouched. Yet Rick and Susanna Wamsley were dead, victims of a brutal, calculated attack. Initially, there was no clear motive. Detectives questioned neighbors, friends, and colleagues, but everyone seemed to agree Rick and Susanna were beloved in their community. There were no enemies, no threats, but something about the crime felt off. It wasn't long before investigators turned their attention to the Wamsley's children. Their daughter Sarah was immediately ruled out as a suspect, but their son Andrew raised suspicion. To everyone, Andrew had always been a model son, yet there were whispers about his strained relationship with his parents, especially regarding his lifestyle choices. He'd recently dropped out of college and had begun dating Chelsea Richardson, a woman who had her own troubled past. As the investigation unfolded, a critical piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. When detectives spoke to Andrew's friends, they learned about a conversation he'd had with Chelsea just days before the murders. Andrew had discussed his parents' life insurance policy, a $1 million payout. Chelsea had reportedly been talking about how they could get their hands on the money, but this wasn't enough to implicate anyone directly. The investigation needed more. Then came the breakthrough. A forensic team carefully combed through the crime scene, collecting evidence that would ultimately lead them to the killers. It was a seemingly small clue, a strand of hair found in Rick Wamsley's hand. At first, it didn't seem significant, but when it was sent for testing, it revealed a shocking connection. The hair belonged to Susanna Toledano, a close friend of Chelsea's. Now, investigators had their first concrete lead. Susanna wasn't just a casual acquaintance. She was deeply involved in the conspiracy. Through further questioning, it became clear that the murder wasn't a random act, nor was it a spur-of-the-moment crime. This had been meticulously planned. And as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered the disturbing details of the failed attempts to kill Rick and Susanna months before the successful attack. The first attempt had been a shooting. Chelsea and Andrew had staged an attack on the family car, hoping to kill Rick and Susanna as they returned home. But their plan failed, and the Wamsleys walked away unscathed. In another attempt, they tried to tamper with the vehicle's gas tank, hoping to cause a deadly explosion. Again, luck was on the Wamsleys' side, and they escaped unhurt. The failed attempts only heightened the desperation. By December 11, 2003, the trio had devised a more careful plan. They had studied the Wamsleys' routine, identified weaknesses in their security, and made sure that everything would fall into place. On that night, they would finally execute the plan. Susanna Toledano, though initially hesitant, was drawn in by Andrew and Chelsea's promises. She was the one who physically carried out the murders, shooting Rick and Susanna in cold blood before stabbing them to ensure they were dead. Andrew and Chelsea were there, both orchestrating the attack, yet neither of them pulled the trigger. But the crime wasn't as flawless as they had hoped. A mistake had been made, one that would ultimately lead to their undoing. As the investigation continued, detectives began to focus on Andrew. It was his strange behavior that had raised suspicions from the beginning. His alibi was shaky, and inconsistencies in his story made him a prime suspect. After questioning him extensively, Andrew's story began to crumble. Then Susanna Toledano, overwhelmed by guilt and fear of the consequences, confessed. She told authorities that she had been the one to kill Rick and Susanna, though Andrew and Chelsea had planned everything. Susanna's confession provided the missing link, the final piece of the puzzle. Andrew and Chelsea were both arrested, but the case didn't end there. Susanna's involvement, Chelsea's manipulations, and Andrew's cold calculations made it clear that this crime wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal, manipulation, and the darkest corners of a family that seemed perfect on the outside. The truth was out. The Wamsley family's perfect image had been shattered, and those who should have been the most trusted, the ones who had the most to lose, were the ones responsible for the horrific deaths of Rick and Susanna Wamsley. The Wamsley family murders shook Mansfield, Texas, to its core, and the trials that followed would be no less shocking. As investigators pieced together the events that led to Rick and Susanna Wamsley's deaths, the courtroom became the stage for a high-stakes drama, a quest for justice that would ultimately see those responsible face the consequences of their actions. Andrew Wamsley was the first to stand trial. The prosecutors presented a damning case: a son who had carefully plotted the brutal murders of his own parents to inherit their $1.65 million estate. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood stains in the family home, phone records linking Andrew to his co-conspirators, and a chilling confession from Susanna Toledano all pointed to Andrew's role as the mastermind. Andrew's defense team tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, claiming he was influenced by Chelsea Richardson, his girlfriend. They argued that his decision to kill his parents was driven by a complicated relationship with them and his desperate desire for financial freedom. But the jury wasn't convinced. After a week of tense deliberation, Andrew Wamsley was convicted of capital murder. On March 23, 2005, the jury sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the gravity of the crime, a betrayal so profound that it left the entire community reeling. Andrew, the Wamsley family's own flesh and blood, was now a cold-blooded killer, doomed to live out his days behind bars. Next came Chelsea Richardson. She had been deeply involved in the plot, having helped plan the murders and even participated in the execution. The jury heard how Chelsea had been promised a portion of the inheritance in exchange for her loyalty to Andrew's scheme, but her involvement went beyond mere complicity. She had been present during the attack, watching as the Wamsleys were slaughtered in their own home. Chelsea's trial drew intense public interest. The court was faced with the question of whether she had been manipulated by Andrew or whether she had acted with full knowledge of the crime. Her defense argued that she had been under Andrew's control, a victim of emotional manipulation and coercion. But the prosecution wasn't swayed. They argued that Chelsea was an active participant, driven by her own greed and ambition. The jury convicted Chelsea Richardson of capital murder, and on August 18, 2005, she was sentenced to death. She became the first woman in Tarrant County, Texas, to receive a death sentence in over 20 years. The case drew national attention, with many questioning the fairness of the sentence given Chelsea's personal history and relationship with Andrew. However, in 2011, Chelsea's death sentence was commuted to life in prison after a lengthy appeal process. The court cited her troubled past, including a history of abuse and her relationship with Andrew, as factors in the decision. Despite her appeal for mercy, Chelsea would still spend the rest of her life behind bars. Susanna Toledano's role in the murders was more complicated. While she had participated in the killings, her involvement seemed less intentional than that of Andrew and Chelsea. According to Susanna, she had been coerced into the plan, too afraid to back out once she was involved. Her defense argued that she had been manipulated by both Andrew and Chelsea, and that she was more a victim than a perpetrator. Susanna struck a plea deal with prosecutors. In exchange for her testimony, which helped convict Andrew and Chelsea, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. The court sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. While her sentence was a far cry from the death penalty, it was a reflection of her role in the crime and the need to hold her accountable. Finally, Hilario Cardenas, the IHOP manager who had provided the murder weapon, was also convicted. Although his role was secondary to that of Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna, his actions had been crucial in facilitating the murders. Cardenas was sentenced to 50 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. As the trials came to a close, the Wamsley family's fate was sealed. Justice had been served, but it came at a steep cost. The community of Mansfield, once serene and trusting, was left to grapple with the loss of Rick and Susanna Wamsley. Their deaths, caused by the very son they had raised, left a scar that would never heal. The immediate aftermath of the Wamsley murders left the tight-knit community of Mansfield in complete shock. The town had always been a picture of suburban tranquility, where families knew each other and the most serious crimes were minor thefts. But now, a horror they never imagined had unfolded in their midst. The brutality of the crime was one thing, but the realization that it was all planned by someone inside the Wamsley family made it even harder to grasp. As police worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to the murders, one name kept surfacing: Andrew Wamsley, the son of the victims. At first, Andrew appeared to be a grieving son. He was seen in public, attending memorials, expressing sorrow, but his behavior, or lack of it, raised alarm bells. His calmness, his inability to demonstrate genuine grief, stood in stark contrast to the chaos around him. Investigators began to dig deeper, and the pieces started to fall into place. Andrew's relationship with his parents had been strained for years. His resentment, fueled by a combination of financial instability and a sense of entitlement, had been simmering beneath the surface. But it wasn't just anger that drove him, it was greed. Andrew, along with his girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, had concocted a plan to murder Rick and Susanna for the sole purpose of gaining access to their substantial life insurance policy and inheritance. As the investigation unfolded, the depth of the betrayal became clear. Chelsea, who had been Andrew's accomplice, played a key role in the plot. She was with Andrew every step of the way, from the initial discussions to the brutal execution of the plan. Together, they recruited Susanna Toledano, Chelsea's roommate, to carry out the murders. The trio, driven by their desire for financial freedom, meticulously planned the killings. They failed in previous attempts, but when they finally carried out the murder on December 11th, the brutality of their actions left everyone reeling. Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna all faced justice in court. Chelsea Richardson, who had been directly involved in the killings, was sentenced to death initially, but her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. She became the first woman in Tarrant County, Texas, to be removed from death row after years of legal appeals. Susanna Toledano, who had shown some remorse for her actions, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. And then there was Andrew. Andrew Wamsley's conviction for capital murder was a stark reminder of the consequences of greed and betrayal. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Andrew's cold demeanor contrasted sharply with the devastation of his sister Sarah. She was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered family, struggling to understand how her own brother could be the mastermind behind the brutal murders of their parents. For Sarah, the betrayal cut deeper than the loss itself. Her brother had not only killed their parents, but also destroyed the family she had known. For the Wamsley family, the community, and even for those who had once considered Andrew a friend, the repercussions were devastating. The shockwaves of this tragedy would continue to ripple through Mansfield for years. Neighbors and friends could not fathom how a family that appeared perfect from the outside could harbor such dark secrets. The horror of the Wamsley murders left an indelible mark on Mansfield. It shattered the illusion of safety that had once defined the community, leaving behind unanswered questions. How could Andrew, who had been loved and cared for, become the architect of such horror? And what could have been done to prevent this tragic betrayal? In the end, the Wamsley's story serves as a chilling reminder: even the closest relationships can fracture under the weight of greed. And sometimes, those we trust most are the ones who can hurt us the most. The murder of Rick and Susanna Wamsley was a tragedy that extended far beyond their deaths. It was a betrayal so deep that it shattered the very fabric of their family and their community. A family once united, torn apart by greed, lies, and manipulation. Their son, Andrew Wamsley, orchestrated the brutal murders, driven by a desire for his parents' wealth. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, and her friend Susanna Toledano played key roles in this twisted plot. What was meant to be a quick, clean kill for a fortune turned into a nightmare that would haunt them all forever. Andrew was sentenced to life in prison for his part in the crime, and Chelsea, initially facing a death sentence, was eventually granted a life sentence. Susanna, coerced into the conspiracy, would spend decades behind bars, forever living with the weight of her involvement. The three were left to pay the price for their actions, but the true cost was far greater. The real tragedy lies not just in their punishment, but in the lost lives. Rick and Susanna, taken too soon. The lives of their children, forever marked by their parents' murder, and the community, shaken by the reality that a family could destroy itself from within. This case forces us to ask hard questions. What drives a person to betray those they love most? Is it the pursuit of money, the need to escape a life they're not happy with, or the dangerous power of manipulation? What is it that makes people so blind to the consequences of their actions? The Wamsley family story is a painful reminder that no amount of money can replace the value of love, trust, and loyalty. Once broken, these things can never be restored. For Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna, the cost of their greed will echo in their lives forever. And for Rick and Susanna, their tragic end serves as a lasting warning to us all. If you found this story shocking, leave a comment below with your thoughts on what motivates someone to commit such a crime. And don't forget to hit the like button if you want to see more real-life crime stories like this one. Subscribe for future videos and stay informed about the darkest mysteries that haunt us.